I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today we are discussing AI and energy, but from a specific angle. In a future episode, we'll discuss how AI and energy tech are coming together, but on this episode, I want to focus on something different. In particular, the energy demands of AI technology. What are the legal issues coming out of the generation of the power needed to create and operate AI technology? For those who have read about this, you'll know that AI is power hungry. It takes a lot of energy to run and cool the equipment and facilities that is the backbone of AI data processing. But where does all of that happen? In data centers. And how do data centers get the power necessary to operate? Well, that's a big question. And it's creating a number of legal issues and societal questions that need to be front and center for those learning about AI law. This episode is a continuation of our AI Mastery series on how to spot issues raised by AI across legal disciplines. If you're new to the podcast, check out some of our prior episodes in this AI series that cover ground like AI and IP and cyber and antitrust. All are really a great resource for those learning how AI technology is creating legal issues in a variety of different ways. But this episode actually, frankly, surprised me that we were doing it. When I started this, I did not expect to be doing a whole show on how AI and energy consumption were coming together. If you're like me, you probably don't naturally connect things like AI and FERC and nuclear and energy regulation. And that's actually a mistake. Because as you'll hear, AI means data centers, and data centers mean energy, and lots of it. And in between all of those interactions are a host of issues that need to be spotted and managed by those with responsibility for AI. To discuss, I've invited two of my partners, Amy Roma and Chip Cannon from our energy practice, both of whom are working with tech and energy companies to meet the demand for power by data centers housing AI infrastructure across the United States. Amy, Chip, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here.
Amy, maybe I can start with you. You are both seasoned energy practitioners, and I'm interested in your perspective on where do you see the combination for the increased need for data center capabilities, computing power, interacting with energy and the demands for energy capacity by companies in the US?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So I think we've seen data centers kind of explode in the energy space in a way that nobody could have envisioned even a year ago. The data center discussions, from a legal perspective, used to be largely a real estate conversation with some other practice areas as well, like cyber, like the stuff that you do. Now, a lot of the conversations involve discussions on energy, and it's because of the immense energy use that data centers take. And so when you have a certain number of data centers, it's okay. When you just keep building more and more and more of them, and they need even more energy. So AI uses 10 times the amount of energy as a regular Google search, for example. Then you're going to see that, holy cow, we need so much energy, it's actually impacting our grid. And so I think the current grid use for data centers is according to EPRI, it's about 4%, but by 2030, it's expected to become 9% of the grid. But when you look at the energy demand growth curve used to be this kind of, used to be fairly flat with a steady slope up. Now it's getting steeper and steeper and steeper, and that's largely driven by data centers and their energy needs. And so I was looking at a report the other day that was quoted in the Wall Street Journal that said that there's a projection that we're going to need 25 to 29% more energy within the next decade. And that's double what the energy growth projections were just a year ago. And that's largely driven by AI. And I know Chip is seeing this too. Chip, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure, definitely. And just want to say interconnecting large industrial end users to the grid, it's not something new. It's something that we in the industry have seen, obviously, for decades. But it really is the sheer volume of these end users that are coming onto the system. And just to share kind of one thing that I thought was interesting. So many regulated utilities, electric utilities in the US, have an obligation to go to their state commissions every 2 or 3 years to do what's called integrated resource plan. And it basically lays out their demand, projected demand for a planning horizon, could be 10 years, and how they plan to meet that demand, either from purchasing power or their own generation. Georgia Power did one of these in 2022, I believe. I think they're under a 3-year obligation. They actually came in and filed one early and updated one early a year later with a updated projected demand, and it was 17 times greater, not 17%. It increased 17-fold in the course of a year. The projected demand went from, I think it was like 400 megawatts to 6,600 megawatts over the course of the year. And a lot of that is industrial end users, including data centers.
But I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, I think folks who probably are not steeped in the space have a very rudimentary understanding of how all of this works, and probably so much of it like, well, can I just plug it in? And it sounds like what we're talking about here is if you were to build data centers that are going to be this backbone of this AI technology revolution that we're all experiencing, is that it really requires much deeper thinking, not only about having the right computing power, but to also have the energy sources to be able to drive that. I mean, how is it that you're approaching these problems when clients are coming and saying, hey, I would want to start building out this infrastructure. Can you help me understand how to do it?
Sure, I'm happy to start off. If it's okay, I'd like to provide a little bit of a background because, in my view, the regulations typically lag anywhere from 5 to 10 years behind what's going on in the industry. And I think to some extent that is what we're seeing now. But just to make sure that everybody has some kind of basic facts, under the Federal Power Act, which is the primary governing statute for the U.S. power sector on a federal level, there is at least what was at one point a clear delineation of jurisdiction between the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and FERC and the state commissions. And FERC has jurisdiction over a very limited number of things, and that is the transmission of electric energy in interstate commerce and the wholesale sale of electric energy in interstate commerce. So that basically means a wholesale sale if I'm selling power to you and you're selling it to someone else. The states have jurisdiction over everything else. In particular, states have jurisdiction over a retail sale. So if I sell power to you and you're going to use it to produce something or do work, that is subject to state jurisdiction. So FERC has jurisdiction over the larger grid. Historically, what has happened for data centers is that they have located somewhere on the grid and they purchase their power from the local utility, or in some states, they purchase their power from a third party, a competitive provider, and the local utility delivers it to them. What we have started seeing, and this is in particular over the last couple of years, is that these new loads, these data centers, are now coming in to interconnect to the system co-located with generators. What does that mean? That basically means the data center is on the same site or right adjacent to a generator. But there are different flavors of co-location. In some co-location, the data center itself and the generator are both interconnected to the grid. In other situations, we call behind the meter, the data center is not interconnected to the grid, it's interconnected to the generator. And there are, of course, different flavors of that. There may be an instance in which if the generator goes offline, the data center can still get its power from the grid. In other instances, if the generator is offline, the data center doesn't get any power. So that is the basis of what we're seeing now. And then a lot of things have happened at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission just over the past couple of weeks that really introduces a lot of uncertainty into that co-location situation, in particular where the data center itself is not connected to the grid, but it's connected to the generator. And I know Amy can probably talk about some of the reasons why some of the data centers would prefer to be behind the meter or right next to the generator.
Yeah, I think I would add, when you think about data centers and energy, Chip just talked about a decision that came out of FERC that had to do with a co-located data center that's co-located with a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania, the Susquehanna nuclear power plant. But there's been a whole host of announcements that have come out pertaining to kind of nuclear and data centers. So nuclear is, where I operate in, and so that's my sweet spot. But interestingly enough, the week those announcements came out, the Secretary of Energy told data centers, we welcome you, we support you, bring your own power source. That's a really profound statement from the Secretary of Energy, because she understands and appreciates how much power these data centers are going to need. And it's kind of like, yeah, you guys can come, but there's only a limited ability. There's only a finite number that we can connect into the grid, to Chip's point, right? Or take away from the grid. So if it's a behind the meter type arrangement, it's no longer going onto the grid anymore. It's going directly into that data center. And that was one of the issues that came up with that FERC decision, is they already had a co-located data center. They wanted to increase the amount of power that they were taking away from the nuclear power plant that was providing power to the grid, and increase the amount of power that was being provided to the data center. There was a whole host of things that went on in that decision, and Chip knows it way better than I do. They kind of punted on a procedural issue and said, like, you guys didn't do this the right way, so go back and do it again. But by the way, when you do it, can you take a look at the impact on the price of energy as well as the grid reliability if you do something like that? And so some of the announcements that we're seeing are the type of arrangements that, a few years ago, I never in a million years thought would happen. And so kind of the big things that we've seen is this had to do with a co-located data center and a nuclear power plant. A ton of nuclear power plants right now are in discussions with or have announced intents to do power purchase agreements with data centers. And so that means if a nuclear power plant was providing 1,000 megawatts to the grid and they're looking at doing like a 400 megawatt power purchase agreement, that is power that's no longer available for other uses. And so the fear is that it could drive up the price of electricity for everybody else, and that it could decrease the reliability of the grid, and you're going to have, rolling blackouts, and whatnot. And so the types of arrangements are really interesting, though, on like the nuclear side. And so the kind of the three bins they fall in is to like the power purchase agreement with a co-located site that Chip was talking about. And that's what we saw with the Susquehanna power purchase agreement that was being reviewed by FERC. The other is restarting shutdown nuclear power plants. And it's something that people have talked about. Oh, once you shut down a nuclear power plant, a lot of these plants were shut down. We've seen a recent uptick in plants that were shutting down nuclear power plants because they were older, but they also were in uneconomic markets. They weren't being valued for the carbon-free power that they provided. They weren't being valued for the reliability. Nuclear is super highly reliable. And they ended up shutting down because their local grid didn't seem to, appreciate them, and they weren't the cheapest form of electricity. Now we're seeing that data center big tech companies are entering into contracts with these plant owners to restart them. So we've seen that for both Palisades plants and for the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, which is being renamed the Crane Energy Center. And 3 Mile Island was the site of kind of the only major nuclear incident we've ever had in the United States back in the late 1970s. We're seeing the plant get restarted, and it will be restarted to provide power exclusively for the data center. So it avoids the problem that you would have of taking power away from the grid because it wasn't otherwise providing power to the grid. And you're restarting a plant, which is a costly thing to do, but the data centers are willing to pay the premium in order to make that happen. And for the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, just for context about how much power we're talking about, the plant is enough to provide power for 800,000 people. Or the data center, right? That's an immense amount of power. And then the third type of arrangement we're seeing data centers directly enter into contracts with companies that are developing new nuclear reactor technologies. And so we saw a slew of announcements come out a few weeks ago, the biggest of which was Amazon was the anchor investor for a $500 million equity investment in a company called X Energy. And then they also announced the plan to deploy 64 new nuclear reactors using the X Energy advanced nuclear reactor technology, with the first being a plant in Energy Northwest in Washington state. So it's going to be 4 nuclear reactor units at around like 360 megawatts with the ability to scale up to like 960 megawatts. The other thing we saw Google announced a 500 megawatt agreement with Kairos Energy, which is also developing an advanced nuclear reactor. They actually have a license from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for a prototype reactor. And that one they didn't make an equity investment, but, those announcements came 2 days apart, and that's for 5.5 gigawatts of energy. And since then, we've seen more announcements come out with Oklo and some data centers. So the fact that the data centers are putting skin in the game and like taking equity investments in these new technologies that have not yet been commercialized, but are kind of imminent for deployment. It's from a nuclear side of things, it's really interesting for me to see, but it also shows how much energy is really driving the business considerations that the big tech companies are making for them willing to make these types of investments. And the one thing I'd say is Microsoft has done the first fusion power purchase agreement in the world, and fusion is a technology that hasn't even been commercialized yet. We haven't even really hit break-even fusion, but it's an investment that Microsoft is willing to make again because it needs those clean, reliable electrons, and it needs it soon.
I mean, so many fascinating things that you both have just raised here. I mean, I want to just maybe pause on a couple of them, which I think would be really interesting to folks who follow this podcast. One is just the sheer amount of power that is required to run these data centers. I think if I heard Amy, your quote correctly, is that when we're talking about restarting the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, it can be able to support 800,000 households or one data center.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, so that gives probably a real world experience of how much data is consumed by these data centers. But then also, the other points that you're flagging are really key societal questions around, frankly, how data centers are, one, to maybe use like the BYOP program that they have, like you have to bring your own power, and what that means for a carbon perspective, what that means from a perspective of an issue that you know better than anyone else, Amy, around nuclear and the ability of using nuclear and around clean energy, and how data centers are now being pulled into that debate. And then also, I think, Chip, you were mentioning that when data centers are being plugged into the grid, there's a very real world competition between the amount of power that they are demanding versus the ability of providing power for other household uses or other uses by citizens in ways that I don't think probably most people understand.
Yeah, and I think that's correct. And, about 2 weeks ago, actually right on the same day that FERC issued this order that Amy mentioned, which we can talk about, FERC actually had an all-day technical conference on the co-location of data centers. And obviously, you don't get much resolution from a regulatory technical conference, but I think it did a very good job of highlighting some of the issues that are here. The most immediate one was the fact it's really a matter of cost allocation. If you have a grid cost allocation, if you have a data center that's not connected to a grid, but it's getting its power from a generator that is connected to the grid, arguably that data center is not using any transmission on the grid. And so there's a question about whether or not it's paying its fair share of the cost of the grid, because even though it's not connected to the grid, it still needs the grid to exist in order to get power from the generator. So there's a big issue about cost allocation. When these data centers are going off grid, are they leaving costs stranded that somebody else is going to have to pay, for example? But what really came out was the technical conference was something that you just mentioned, and that is the question of resource adequacy. And when I say resource adequacy, or we talk about it in the power sector, it basically means, is there enough generation on the grid to meet all of the needs? And a lot of this discussion takes place in Atlantic, Midwest region. We call it the PJM. It's the PJM administrator. It's the largest power market in the world, and is starting to face real challenges with resource adequacy. And by all accounts, will be running short by the end of the decade. And so that is the primary concern, is that power that's actually needed for other consumers is being diverted to data centers. And it raises questions, for example, if the generator goes off, who loses their lights? Is it the data center, or is it a couple of 10,000 of homes? Does it make a difference if the data center is doing AI as opposed to cryptocurrency? All of these are issues that have not yet been resolved, but people are looking at. And one thing I think is really interesting that came out of the technical conference is a representative of the data center said there, we would love to interconnect directly to the grid and not go behind the meter to an individual generator, but we can't, because you can't do it on our timeline. There's not enough generation. If we bring our own generation to the grid to support us, it takes anywhere from 5 to 7 years to get that generator interconnected to the grid. And if we connect front of the meter, if we connect to the grid, there are going to be all of these upgrades that we're going to have to be responsible for and pay for, and it's just not on our timeline. So in order to stay on our timeline for data centers, we have to go behind the grid, and that's what's really driving. It's somewhat circular. They're doing this because of resource adequacy concerns, but it's contributed to additional resource adequacy concerns.
Scott, I just add one quick thing on the data centers. When we're talking about their energy consumption, it's not just that they need to consume lots of energy to make money, right? They need to consume lots of energy to keep their equipment cool. And if they lose power or have lack of reliable access to power, they can actually have significant damage to their equipment that can cost tens of millions of dollars pretty quickly. And so the reason they're looking for really reliable power sources is because they can't really weather a power outage that well.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, but it also kind of then goes back to Amy, the point you were making around blackouts and, who is the first one to be turned offline when it is you have more demand than supply, and how governments, how society, how kind of commercial actors are going to balance those things, including, is this a fair market? Is there a fair market principles here, which is, I think, sounds like it's going to result, if you have a finite amount of energy that can be produced and an increased amount of demand for it, that means that it's more expensive, presumably. And does that cost get then passed to consumers? Does that cost get passed to the AI companies? How are those issues being sorted?
So just a real quick data point, and I always like to mention this, and then Chip, I'll pass the microphone to you, is when people think of power outages, a lot of times people are like, well, it's an inconvenience, or I don't want my power to go out because I need to charge my phone and watch TV or whatnot. But when the power goes out, people die, right? That's what happens. And if you just look at the data look at the, anything in Puerto Rico after a hurricane hits and then trying to get power back online. I have a friend that runs a radiation oncology clinic, and they were having to fly patients back and forth to Miami in order to give people cancer treatments because they didn't have power. And in Texas, I always kind of use this as another example. Texas, a couple of years ago had an unexpected freeze happen, and it knocked out power while it was also very cold. And 110 people died. And the power was only out for, a few days. It wasn't that long, but 110 people died, and it cost billions of dollars in economic damages. And so when you sit there and you have to make judgments about who gets power, it's not it's who gets heat, who gets access to things that they need in order to survive, not only the economic implications, which are pretty significant. And then on that happy note, Chip, I'll pass the mic to you.
Sure. Maybe we can get back to the order that you mentioned that FERC issued on the same day as the technical conference in this Susquehanna proceeding. So the problem with FERC's order and that decision was, in the context of the litigation leading up to the FERC order, a lot of these issues were raised. Issues about reliability of behind the meter generation, what happens, who gets curtailed first, what role is there at the states? Once again, FERC has jurisdiction over the whole grid, but that last sale of electrons is subject to state jurisdiction, and it starts getting really, really murky. All of these issues were raised in litigation that lasted about 120 days, and FERC essentially punted on everything. In an order, I think, that had probably 80 paragraphs, only 4 or 5 were actually substantive. And they basically dismissed the filing, as Amy said, on very procedural grounds. So this proceeding had been kind of set up to start providing the industry with some clarity on these issues, interconnection related issues, curtailment related issues. And FERC basically ended it very unceremoniously without any guidance as to how to get resolution on these issues going forward. Now, there are a lot of other FERC proceedings out there where the commission may start to be able to provide some guidance. The technical conference will probably, or it could lead to a rulemaking proceeding, but that takes absolutely years. So the concern, and one of the reasons why I think we keep mentioning this order, is that it created a significant amount of uncertainty for data centers that come in behind the meter, both in terms of timing as well as execution of some of those arrangements. And it has really raised some concerns, I think, with people who are concerned about the larger impact on national security concerns, because we are and we should be focused on creating a very, very robust data center platform here in the US so we don't have to outsource that to other countries. And FERC's actions, unfortunately, introduced a fair amount of uncertainty into that process.
So, as we continued on with this series on the podcast around, how individual lawyers who are working with their organizations can spot and to try to address legal issues across legal disciplines as their organizations are using AI, one common theme is that quote unquote AI lawyers need to have so many different arrows in their quiver. They need to have so many ability to be able to appreciate issues outside of their core legal discipline or core legal expertise. And it seems as though one of those key areas has to be not just looking at how to spot the privacy issues, the cyber issues, the patent issues, the IP issues. It has to be, how is it that we have created the physical infrastructure that would support the AI activities that an organization is looking to proceed with? Because if the case is that, I think everyone would see is like, oh, well, this is just like the equivalent of I can throw up another internet page on the internet, all good. Like there's infinite amount of web pages that we can create. The reality is, with respect to the increased demand for resources associated with artificial intelligence, is that that's not the case. There is a finite amount that we can actually produce, at least with our current infrastructure. And as AI lawyers are grappling with all of the legal issues that are coming up, energy has to be part of that list.
Very, very much. I would agree with everything that you just said. I would add 3 words: location, location, location. As I said at the very beginning of the podcast, states are the ones that actually have jurisdiction over that sale of power to the data center. It's not the federal government. It's not FERC. And each state treats retail sales very differently. In some states, only the utility can sell to the data center. In some places, the data center can get it from a third party. Behind the meter generation is not even permitted in every state. Not every state is part of a regional power pool, power markets where you have liquid markets. So there is a lot of granularity when you start looking at this. I think a lot of the discussion that we've had so far has been primarily in the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast region. A lot of times these issues tend to percolate up there more quickly because they have their markets are typically moving at a little bit faster speed than some other places in the US. But it really depends on where you are located.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I have a lot of clients because I work in the nuclear space and I work on the new technology side, right? I have a lot of clients that are either industrial end users or they're the technology providers. And where they put their facility matters as to what their entire contractual relationship looks like. And so a lot of them kind of don't. If you're already an industrial company, like and you don't have a co-located facility and you haven't encountered this before, you've always just been connected into the grid, you need to understand, what am I able to do? And then how do I do that? If you're a technology company, you can't then go in and say to a end user, hey, I'm just going to build right next door to you and I'll give you all your power, if the state doesn't permit something like that to happen. And so I'm seeing a lot of these conversations come up, like I would say in funny ways, because people don't realize it until they actually start to engage with the state about deploying their project, what these restrictions were. And so that's a really important thing. And then just as like a funny little antidote, right? Like I live in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia has lots of data centers. I'm starting to have my neighbors call me who are involved in like local county government because they're like, we have to approve a whole lot of data centers and we don't know anything about them, but we know that they use a ton of energy and you're in the energy space. Like, one local like selectman called me and said, hey, this data center told me it's going to build a nuclear power plant. It was like a mile from my house. And I'm like, that is not true. Like they're not like, but these are what local politicians and state politicians, like they're making decisions now and making sure that they have the right information and that everybody kind of understands like how these various players come together is really important.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating. And I don't think that that's probably well understood, at least by the technology lawyers who are advising organizations, many of whom probably nearly all of whom don't consider themselves to be energy lawyers, and don't have the legal expertise that you have. So maybe as I kind of think about this, and maybe as we close here, maybe from each of your perspectives, as technology lawyers or folks who are, helping their businesses start to deploy AI at scale, do you have questions that you would encourage them to ask their business stakeholders in terms of how they can create both a physical source of the ability of supporting those projects and maybe the resiliency of having that to be a continued offering?
I mean, I think resiliency should be at the top of everyone's mind. And as I mentioned, there's been a lot of discussion about our data centers or industrial end users, or how are they treated differently? Should the grid treat a data center differently if it's used for national security reasons? Or should that be up to the Department of Energy when it is negotiating an arrangement with a generator to resolve that issue amongst themselves without pulling in the rest of the grid? You mentioned also earlier some larger societal concerns. There have also been discussions about, there's going to be probably a lot of new natural gas generation to support a lot of this. What do we as a society think about that? It's one thing perhaps to have those carbon increases if you're serving AI or data centers that serve national security purposes. Is it really the same resolution for cryptocurrency miners? These are just all a lot of issues that the regulators are starting to think about. But once again, they're very much like a lot of the industry. They're kind of behind the curve, and we're looking right now for reading the tea leaves of what's coming out with the regulators. Hopefully, we'll start seeing the semblance of some policy consideration sooner rather than later. Also, just on the order that we mentioned, I did want to mention one thing. So the commission, FERC, has 5 members. 2 of them are recused because of conflicts before they joined the commission. 1 voted against the order. So we have an order that was really only voted on by 2 commissioners. So we really don't understand yet kind of what the full commission would see in terms of these policy issues.
Yeah, 2 out of 5. So
2 out of 5, yeah.
Yeah, not the majority. And then the other thing I would just add is this is definitely a watch this space. I mean, the stuff that we're talking about, a lot of these announcements came out within weeks of each other. The FERC order, the Amazon investment in X Energy, the Microsoft restart for 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, the Secretary of Energy saying bring your own power source, the announcement between Google and Kairos, another advanced reactor. These all happened all within a few weeks. This is a very active and evolving space, and there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of things that are going to have to coalesce, both on the business side with what companies are doing behind the scenes. So I think it's also important to realize, how are companies contracting with, working together to try to resolve these issues? What are the regulators doing? What's the federal government doing? What are the state governments doing? What are local governments doing? I mean, these are all very active spaces with lots of conversations going on that are going to impact how this all ends up.
Yeah, well, I can imagine you both are very busy, given that you're at the epicenter of kind of the new AI-driven world that we all find ourselves in. But with that, Amy, Chip, I think I learned so much on this podcast, and every single time I get to interact with you both. Thank you so much for joining. With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.